Welcome to ESC Enclosure Review. And don't worry folks, before we get started, I've got a run sheet. I've learnt my lesson from my past YouTube video. We'll keep it quick, concise, and keep the ball bouncing, right? So I've got a few 3D printed enclosures, mine. I've got some enclosures that have been printed from other folks online, and a really cool enclosure from Idea, which I'm going to give a video walkthrough because everybody seems to be looking at other ESC enclosures, but the poor old Idea's been left alone. Well, till now, of course. So thank you, welcome, and let's get cracking. So ever since folks have started building electric off-road mountain boards, the need to have external ESC enclosures, it's been there, right? And the most common one used is the Pelicase 1050. It's small and it's watertight, easy to deploy, easy to install, and it's readily available. 3D printed ones have also taken off in popularity as well, and there's a whole range of designs available. I think if you were to look back and say who was, which folks really put their stamp on a really cool looking ESC top mounted enclosure, you can't go past Apex. There were a few others floating around. I think Etox might have been around prior, but the Apex one was really unique in that they moved all the cable routing to be undermounted on the ESC enclosure. It's a shame I don't have one here with you, although I have built with one in the past. If you go to the ZFG ESC promotion website, you'll see Alice in Chains has one mounted on there. It was really well engineered, almost too well engineered in fact, and I'll get to that in a second. But I think what stood out is the cool factor. It was nice, slim, sleek, under-mounted cable routing, which means that you can hose your board down, and because the cables are routed rather than the rear of the enclosure and having rubber grommets, they're routed below and go under the ESC enclosure, so you can hose it down from the top, wash all your mud off, and be on your way, and your precious electronics aren't going to get stunned, right? So now when I said all too well engineered, it's a three-piece design, so top, middle, and base. Now, because the cable routings come underneath, the amount of tolerance to get those cables out from below the Apex enclosure, it's on the tight side. Ideally, 3 more millimeters would have been nice to give us DIY builders a bit more playroom. But what it does mean is that because you have to work extra hard, you get really good results when you put the effort in, and the proof's in the pudding, right? Just take a look at some of the Apex builds that are out there. They are spot on and they look sweet. So if you are going to look at the Apex enclosure, it is a great system, it's a great setup. Just be wary and take your time. Also, follow Lee's videos, right? He's got some really cool content that he goes through where he talks about the install process and can guide you through. So I don't need to do that now because it's already been done. So yeah, so in a nutshell, that's the Apex. That's my experience with the Apex enclosure. I don't have it here to demonstrate, but that's okay. Go to Lee's website and his YouTube channel and run through his videos, right? So next we'll get to the Idea. We're going to have a look at what it looks like, and we'll do a pull apart session to see how that stacks up against the Apex. Okay, cool. All right, so this is the Idea ESC top mounted enclosure. Now I've gone ahead and undone all the top nuts, and one thing I did want to point out with the Apex and Idea enclosures, they assume that you're going to install a Stormcore or a BKB Zenith, and so they have a cutout for the on-off switch. In this case, my ESC preference is Maker X, and I don't use on-off switches because I'm
old school and still use an anti-spark plug, right? So I've just 3D printed a little circle, sprayed it, made a nice finish on that and hot glued it in from the bottom. So I'm going to take this off and you're going to see what it looks like on the inside, if I can get it out. You know, like I said, you can always practice something, and then when you want to execute it, it's in there pretty good. Come on, let's go. Let's go. Maybe I didn't undo all the screws properly. Hey, there you go. There you go. Okay, there it is. Get it out. Get it out. Oh, oh, there it is. Oh, it looks pretty neat. I'd say it looks really neat. So I'm going to turn this upside down. Hopefully I don't drop any other bolts over. So that's what it looks like from the inside. Just a bit of hot glue. It looks nasty, I know, please forgive me. But all up, this, the way it's designed, it's 1, 2, 3, 4 piece, and I'll get to the bracket soon, right? I just want to show this top section here. What I really like about this enclosure, specifically the way it handles the Maker X ESC, is that it offsets the ESC over to one side, so it gives you plenty room to have your little gizmos, you know, your Bluetooth. You could probably fit a robo in there as well. What I do want to point out is the cable routing on this bracket is really cool, in that unlike the Apex enclosure, this has front mounted cable routing options and also rear mounted cable routing options. It also means that I can fit an XT90 connector up through these holes without having to do any in-place soldering. It's a big win for me. I hate doing in-place soldering. So you've got really good options in terms of cable routing, depending on what ESC you choose from. So this is, I think it's a more universal top-mounted ESC enclosure, whereas I think on the Apex side, it works really well for the BKB. I struggled a little bit with the Maker X. It still works. You just got to take your time a little more, right? But I think this one's more user-friendly more than anything else. Okay. So yeah, so you can see that we have a Bluetooth on this side. We have our VX2 receiver on this side. I've wrapped them all up, and we've got some tape just to hold everything in place. An idea, I'd give Apex a 9.5 out of 10 for design, but idea, man, you get 11. And the reason why you get 11 is because you give people the option of routing cables through the front, through the side, or through the rear. And you've also allowed for those extra few millimeters of wiggle room to give you space to do everything in a nice, easy way. So I really like this bracket for that reason, and this is why I give this an 11 out of 10, I guess, if I'm allowed to do it. But it's really cool in that this has to be the most favorite part of this ESC enclosure. It is this bracket system right here. I've never seen anything like it. I love it. I wish more people would do it. There you go.
Right, so before we cut to looking at 3D printables and the different types of ESC enclosures available, I did want to mention, if you go back and take a look at the mounting bracket system of the idea, I forgot to mention that it does have the ability to slide the ESC enclosure up and down as well, so you can get a really good position depending on where you want it to sit relative to your bindings. It's something that is really cool and has been really well thought out as well. So yeah, all right, so that's the idea. The next one, I saw this enclosure on Eastgate News forum, And when I looked at it, I thought, wow, that looks flipping cool, right? And I wanted to have a go at printing it, I wanted to have a go at installing it, and just communicate that it is an awesome enclosure, although you are going to have to put some time and effort into making sure that it's spot on. So please don't judge the electrical tape holding it all together. That's my bad, right? Printing it, I highly recommend using PTEG. Don't use PLA. PTEG is much more is much stronger, right? I'll put the link to the to where you can get the printables for this as well. And if you are going to print it, it is recommended you add a raft and supports as well, because the way the ESC enclosure is designed, the lid and base aren't flat, so you have to have support to make sure that you have a solid print on that. So that's what it looks like out of the printer. Snaps off fairly easy. Also, depending on the orientation that you print it on, you're either going to get a little bit of a rough finish, or if you choose to print it this side up with your supports staying under, which I did for this second test print I ran, you'll get a much cleaner top surface. So I'll leave it to you, but please have that as a consideration if you are going to go down to this print, how you want your top surface to be finished. Alright, so I'm going to head over and we're going to cut this guy open and get stuck into it.
Alrighty, let's hack into it. And I just want to be clear that this, the apex, I think I've mentioned, and the idea, they all come with this on-off button, although in my case I'm using a Maker X, so I needed to put a bung in there, and of course I had one of these boys lying around, so I just chucked it in there. Now the reason why I have electrical tape sitting around here was because I printed this test print in PLA, and it was a nice hot sunny day out in the Mornington Peninsula, where I left my board out getting full sun for a little while, and of course the end result is it melted. I just want to point out that you'll see that after I printed this, like I said before, I left it in the sun. It was using some cheap PLA. You can clearly see it's warped, right? So a good reason, if you're going to print your ESC enclosures, don't use PLA, use PTEG. It has a higher degree of heat resistance, and also it's stronger as well, right? So now for the big unveiling, let's lift this guy up. And what do we got there? It's not too much of a disaster, but you can clearly see that this ESC enclosure was designed for the Stormcore, and I've never had the opportunity to work or install a Stormcore, although with the Maker X it is so tight, like it is. Ideally I need an extra 5mm either side and it'll be a perfect ESC enclosure, although as it is now it is fairly tight. And in here I've got a Robo and I've got my Hoyt sitting here as well, and everything's just packed right in. Okay, so tightness, this ESC enclosure uses 4mm screws, which like that, and the idea is that you have the a brass insert sitting at the bottom and it screws down from the top, which is really cool, really ingenious, right? But what I really like about this ESC enclosure is if we can lift this sucker up, and I'll bring the camera around just so you can see it a little better, because you can't really get it from there, is that you'll notice that there are no, you can't have the, you don't see the truck mounting holes there at all. They sit recessed underneath the ESC enclosure, but what you have is from the top, I'm able to put in thread inserts into some of the unused mounting, truck mounting holes that come shipped on a deck and screw it in that way. which is pretty cool. I haven't seen that done in an ESC enclosure before. Now what it does mean is that you lose space on the inside because it sits flush against the deck. So more material is needed to lift this up, not much more, probably about 4 millimeters, 3 to 4 millimeters, although it does take away from space up the top. And you'll see that when I took the lid off, everything has to be packed on the sides. Nothing can be packed on the top. The lid does have provision. It does allow for some of the wiring to be tucked in there, although not much. You don't get much tolerance there at all, right? So I'm gonna unscrew this, unscrew these 2 bolts and show you the way I mounted this ESC enclosure. I liked the way I mounted this ESC enclosure. Possibly people are gonna say, ew, that's not the right way to do it, but I don't care. Another thing I wanna point out is that the phase wires tend to float loose, and what would have been nice, and I'm going to do this on one of my ESC enclosures later, is that just some way in which there is a little hook right there, so you can just slide that through and zip tie your phase wire on the side there, just so it doesn't move around too much, right? So anyway, that would be a nice to have. Right, so I've now undone these 2 screws. Let's get them out completely. Boom, boom, and we're off. Check that out. So that's pretty cool, right? So there's 2 holes there, which I've put in a couple 4 millimeter thread inserts. So you can see that right there. And that just allows me to bolt it straight to the deck, and it sits flush to the deck. And when we look under this ESC enclosure, you can see how those truck mounting screws sit in the spaces provided. And you can also see those brass M4 thread inserts sitting all around the enclosure. So they have to be installed, and you can hot glue them in or arrow dye them in to keep them in position. But I'm gonna disconnect everything, and then we're gonna talk about this enclosure a little bit more, because I really like the amount of effort and thought and engineering that's got into it. So I'm gonna stop the vid and we'll restart in a sec. All right, a few key points of why this ESC enclosure is super cool, right? I mentioned before, recessed holes here, so it sits flush on your deck and your truck mounting screws sit within there. It utilizes these 2 holes as an option to mount it flush to your deck using the thread inserts. Now, I don't know if that was intentional or not, but the holes were there and I made use of them. I do like the way in which these brass thread inserts don't have to be melted into the ESC enclosure. I see some folks, when they make ESC enclosures, they use a soldering iron to put those thread inserts in, although the design on this allows them to sit recessed in, and then there's enough room for you to drop in and screw down, right? So really cool. A lot of thought was put into that. I also like the fact that there's a nice little lip there that prevents water ingestion, I guess. So if you are giving it a spray from the top, it's highly unlikely that you'll get water that can creep up above that lip and into the ESC enclosure as well. And while we're on water ingestion, I really like the thought that's been put into Apex and Idea. They both have hole positions mounted underneath, so no wire roundings around the side. Although with this enclosure, what you'll see is, once you print it out, you'll appreciate it more, that there's actually a lip under each of these. So if it is sitting flush against the deck, what happens is water will beat up against that lip, and there's channels along here as well, which is really cool. And it clearly shows that a lot of thought's been put into the development of this ESC enclosure. Because one, I'm not going to say it's a negative, although, yeah, I will say one of the negatives, because it has to cater for the recessed truck mounting holes, more material needs to be added, and this is raised significantly. And what happens is you lose a lot of space on top of the ESC. So when you mount it in, you don't really have room to wrap wires around there. There is no way you could fit an ESC and have an XT90 sitting on top of that. There's the space just isn't there, right? So that kind of sucks. And when you think about it, the ESC enclosure itself, it is in terms of height. Put the lid on there, and we get the groovy calipers out. You know, that is sitting at nearly 50 millimeters in height. So there is the opportunity to have that additional space, although I don't think it was utilized completely. And I guess that's because, you know, the designer had specific needs that that he needed to get out of it, and also aesthetics as well. And it works. So if you're using a storm core, you have specific requirements, then yeah, this is absolutely great. If you're going to use any other ESC, just approach it with caution, and that is the space may be limited there. Another, if I can say a negative, you know, in-place soldering, there's no room to squeeze through an XT90 connector. So you got to do in-place soldering to get that connector through and plug that into your ESC and then back out again. So if it's not so much of a hassle, it's a one-time config, although for me, because I'm always rebuilding and testing new things out, it is a bit of an annoyance because you got to chop the wires, put another connector in every time you swap a new component in, and whatever else. So, but all up, I really like this ESC. A lot of thoughts being ESC enclosure. A lot of thoughts being put into the enclosure itself, and it is really, really cool. Okay. So yeah, so I had to think about if I were to steal or borrow elements from Apex, Idea, and I'm going to have trouble pronouncing the name, but I'm just going to say Poastoast. How would that look like, and how could I maximize an enclosure space so it doesn't matter what you're using, it's universal, I guess. So what I came up with is that I already had for some time I think it's common, the design element that's used across some of these enclosures. They all follow the same relative design element, in that from a shape perspective. Also, I wanted to take away the design element that everything is undermounted, so it's all smooth on the outside. And I like the fact that this specific ESC enclosure is a one-piece bottom and wall as well, because it just means that there's less hardware needed to secure the base down. Okay. With the version that I'm looking at here, hardware is a key issue in that I wanted to use the least amount of components as possible. So one of the items was that I didn't want any brass thread inserts to be used, but rather have holes that are 3.6 millimeters in width that are sufficient enough for an M4 screw to thread and bite in without any problems, and where it won't bulge out. So that's been tested and it works really well. I did want to take away that design element from this one in that, and from Apex and Idea, in that undermounted, I
cabling is a must, but also the ability to fit an entire XT90 connector straight through in there. If you're coming up from underneath, it just makes it nice and easy, no in-place soldering. It's great, it's convenient. So that's one consideration that was done. While I did like the idea that the truck inserts were recessed in the base, I didn't like the fact that more material needed to be used and you lost space inside the enclosure. So even though this works out to be 50 millimeters in height, in reality it's less than 40 millimeters possibly of usable space. So I wanted to flip that around and have, rather than having the thread, the screws sit inside, they just poke through, right? So what that means is that you can lift your ESC enclosure out and still undo your trucks, swap them out and swap in a new set of trucks without taking the enclosure off. You can still keep the enclosure on. If you want a degree of waterproofing, by all means you can silicone down or add some rubber to the bottom of that as well. And one thing I did want to steal and borrow is the fact that these two screws come into play, right? And that just allows for a thread insert, a screw, M4 screw, to be recessed in there, and it sits perfectly, nice and tight. You can also, if you're not confident with an M4 screw, you can get an M5 thread insert, although there are certain ones that won't fit in the space of the deck, but that's an M5 bolt. And again, that sits in there, and that's a bigger boy, and you might feel that gives you more security, right? So that's great. Another element, so this I'd consider a version 1, because version 2, like I mentioned earlier, I do want to have something on the side that's going to allow for a zip tie to be added in. So when you are wiring out your phase wires and your sensor cable, that they can sit flush against the side of the enclosure and not flop around and hit the wheel or anything else. So that's another design element I want to bring across to this design, which will be available for free to download from my site. So the only thing I chose not to do was create the lip. Maybe my design skills aren't quite there yet, although I don't think it's necessary. And when I did do the print on this specific enclosure, depending on how good your printer is and what's going on and warpage, it works, okay, but it might not work for everybody. So in an effort to just make something really simple, clean and easy to install, I just made a flat lid. Also, because there's no uneven shapes or surfaces, this enclosure is really easy to get a high finish just with using some filler, sanding it back and spraying it in your favorite color, right? So that's a huge advantage. And so check that ESC enclosure out. The files will be available soon, and I think I'll be making complete available to be purchased with all the necessary hardware. So rather than you having to go to Amazon and .com.au or Marketplace or whatever your favorite online store is, and buy your M4 bolts separate and thread inserts separate. Right, so I had to wait for the camera to cool down. So I was talking about the ESC enclosure coming with all the needed hardware, all in one shot, so you can just grab it, install it and go. If you did want to have this absolutely waterproofed, then my suggestion is, once you've routed all your connectors through, is just add silicone in on and fill those gaps right up. And once you've bolted and torqued that lid down, you'd easily be able to hose off your board from the top and no water would get in. I'd be fairly confident in saying that because I've tested on other enclosures that I've built that have had that similar design concept where it's flat. I get that there's no lip, although I don't think it's necessary. The idea doesn't have a lip and Apex doesn't have a lip either. And they repel water just fine, just with the force of the top mounted down on the ESC enclosure itself. So there you go. If you are going to print it, you will need support, and that's specifically around these areas here. So you do make sure you add support in. The other neat thing is that this is the only support required for the entire enclosure, and even if you have a newbie type 3D printer, you're still going to get great quality. I did find that on this type of enclosure, the support needed is far greater. It's not such of a big deal, right? But at the end of the day, if you want to conserve PLA or PTEG, yeah, absolutely, it's a consideration. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Hope it was quick. Hope it flowed. Like, subscribe. Adios.